All right, guys, we're going to talk about evolution today. We're going to start this off. This is going to be an overview of evolution. We're not going to cover everything there is to know about evolution. Just like most of the topics in 7th grade life science, we're doing a survey. So imagine you're up in an air balloon, or you're like lawn chair Larry that attached several weather balloons to his lawn chair, and he floated up into the sky and planned on shooting down the weather balloons with a pellet gun to come back down. That's what we're doing. We are going to zoom out. We're going to go pretty high up, look at evolution from a distance, look at some of the things that cause evolution, look at some of the things that are not evolution, and the evidences for evolution, and that's about it. Then we'll talk about speciation, and throughout that we'll be talking about genetics and the needs of animals and stuff like that. So let's go ahead and get started. This is an overview, and I want you to take notes as you need to. I'm not going to pause a whole lot. If you need to, you can pause this video and you can take notes on what you need to. So real quick review, these are things that we've talked about already in previous units. We talked about genetics. So artificial selection. Artificial, if you have artificial flavoring, that means not natural flavoring. It's going to be some kind of man-made flavoring. Natural flavoring is going to be some kind of juice or something from nature. Really weird example of natural, even though it is natural, it's not very good, is there's, I believe it's vanilla. The taste of vanilla can come when you see something that has vanilla natural flavoring, natural vanilla flavor. It might not actually be vanilla, which is a plant. It could be a secretion from a beaver or an otter. I can't remember. So don't hold me to that, but it's something like that. There's a natural flavor that is actually from an animal that tastes like a plant's taste. So I know it's kind of strange, but natural just means it comes from nature, not really having to do with man. Artificial means it's coming from humans, from man or woman. So artificial selection is when a man or a woman, a human, does the selecting. So that would be an example of wolves to dogs. That would be artificial selection. Natural selection would be something that happens in nature apart from humans. So if a red cardinal, the male cardinals are very bright red, and they're that way because of natural selection. Because the female cardinals, the red birds, they prefer bright colors in the males, and the ones that are brightly colored get to reproduce. The ones that aren't brightly colored, they don't get to reproduce, so they don't pass those genes on. So that's natural selection. So I want you to know what the force behind the change is. Artificial selection, the force behind that is human choosing, human desires, human force. That's the force. Natural selection, the force is nature. It's nature. So it's going to be something. If you want to think Mother Nature as a person, if you want to personify nature, it would be Mother Nature that decides. In reality, it's things like colors and preferences of animals and what's easiest to find, what's hardest to find, what's easiest to reproduce with, what's most difficult to reproduce with, stuff like that. So what's that? A trait, a specific characteristic of an organism. In genetics, a physical trait. What is a physical trait called in genetics? If you said phenotype, then you are correct. So when we talked about the physical traits of an organism, we talked about the phenotype, the physical being phenotype. If you remember, a genotype is the genetic makeup of that organism. So we talked about, like, we did that in the form of letters, like big B, little b, big Z, little z. Those are the genes, the actual genes. That's the genotype. The physical trait, the phenotype is the actual physical characteristic. So in genetics, physical trait, a lot of times we'll call that the phenotype. And so when we're talking through evolution, we're normally going to be talking about the phenotype, but make sure that you remember that behind the phenotype is a genotype that determines that phenotype. So you may have red hair. If you have naturally red hair, then you have genes or a gene that is determining that red hair. Now, if you just colored your hair red, you don't have genes for that. But physical traits that are genetic, you always have a gene that determines that thing. And then a mutation, we've touched on this a little bit. This one's probably the one that we've talked about least of these three or four. Is a mutation is the change in a gene, and mutations rarely, they don't happen most of the time when they happen, they don't really do a whole lot to change what's going on in your body. And when they do actually change something, they're almost always bad. They're typically a negative influencer. Sometimes they'll be a positive influence. So again, I gave the example in class. If I were to start giving you numbers 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, 9, 6, 4, 3, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, and I had you repeat, or I had you write down all the numbers that I said, you would make an error somewhere. Now, it may not be a drastic error. Maybe it's just changing a 2 to a 1. But it is going to be an error, and it may have some change. And your genes are copying themselves over and over and over when they're making new cells, going through asexual reproduction, your cells. As they're doing that, there's plenty of room for errors. And your body's really good at making no errors. But there are times when it slips up. And when it slips up, a lot of times it doesn't have any effect. It has no noticeable change. But sometimes there is a change. And most of the time when there is a change, it's going to be a negative effect. So very rarely is there anything bad that happens in those mutations. But when there is, it's normally bad. And so, but occasionally when those mutations happen, there's a good mutation. And that's when, we'll talk about that later, but that mutation gives that organism a better chance of reproducing. So let's keep going. So speciation. Speciation and natural selection. Speciation is a creation of a new species. And if you look at the actual word, that probably makes sense. Like creation is to create something, the process of creating. Speciation, if you take that same process, it's a process of creating a new species, a process of making a species, a speciation. And so if you think about, let's go back to the thing that you're familiar with from talking in class, wolves turning to dogs. Over time, humans artificially selected certain traits out of wolves that were beneficial, things that were like not being aggressive, not running away every time they came close, not being super scared of the humans. And over huge periods of time, a wolf was domesticated, and we call that organism a dog. A new species was formed. So a wolf and a dog are two different things. Off the top of my head, I believe it is Canis lupus is the wolf's DNA, genus and species, and Canis familiaris, like a familiar canine, is the dog. I believe that's right. And so speciation is a creation of a new species. If you look at the definition of species, remember, so it's a group of organisms that can reproduce with one another, and their offspring are fertile. So that means two organisms can have babies that can have babies that can have babies. And you remember, like a horse and a donkey make a mule. Horse and donkey are two separate species. So the mule is a living organism, but it cannot make, it cannot have babies. So in general, the best definition that I have been able to get together, a species is a group of organisms that can reproduce with one another and have fertile offspring. There are some exceptions to that. There are some weird parts of that. If you think about, well, we're not going to go into that, but there are some problems with that. Like, for example, bacteria. There's a bunch of bacteria that are very different from each other, but they're close enough together that we kind of throw them in the same species. So there's not a really hard and fast definition of species, but that's about, if you get that, then I think you'll understand enough. Organisms that are closely related enough so that they can reproduce fertile offspring. If you don't know what fertile means, then right-click on it and click define. Generation time. It's the time between the birth of one generation and the birth of the next. So go and write that down. The period between the birth of one generation and the birth of the next. So for humans, that period is somewhere around 15 years. Now, our society, it is very young to have a child at 15. But it is still physically possible for most 15-year-olds to have a child. And so if you look at trees, they have a generation time. If you look at insects, they have a generation time, the period between one birth and the next. So bacteria have a generation time of, hours, or maybe minutes if it's fast enough. Humans have a generation time of about 15 to 20 years. So generation time is, it changes from one organism to the next, but it takes a lot of generations, hundreds or thousands of generations to change and to make a new species. So check out the next video. We'll talk about natural selection, and we'll keep going through this PowerPoint.